I realise it is a very great honour, and I am most grateful. I would like to try to express my thanks to you in Welsh also.
They tried to erase this painting from existence. Why? Because it showed Princess Diana like you've never seen her before. Blood, terror, a desperate cry for help painted in red across her face. When this image went public, the art world exploded. Critics demanded it be destroyed. The media called it sick and disgusting. Even her own sons wanted it gone. But one billionaire paid a fortune to keep it alive.
I will be reducing the extent of the public life I've led so far.
What did this painting reveal that was so dangerous? The story begins with a single canvas that would ignite one of the biggest art controversies of the early 2000s. Picture this, a painting of Princess Diana wearing her iconic tiara. But something is terribly wrong. Her eyes are wild, almost manic. And from her lips, thick red streaks run down her face. Is it lipstick? Is it blood? The artist left that deliberately ambiguous, and that ambiguity is exactly what made people so uncomfortable. Splashed across the canvas in bold red letters, as if scrawled in desperation, are the words, "Hi Paul, can you come over? I'm really frightened." This wasn't some anonymous work hidden in a basement. This painting would eventually be purchased by one of the world's most influential art collectors, exhibited in prestigious galleries, and spark fierce debates about taste, exploitation, and the boundaries of art itself. But before we get to all that, we need to understand what this painting was really about and why it struck such a nerve with the public. The title refers to Paul Burrell, Diana's trusted butler and confidant. In the years following Diana's death, Burrell revealed something chilling. He claimed that Diana had written him a letter expressing genuine fear for her life. She believed that someone, somewhere, was plotting against her. Whether you believe in conspiracy theories or not, the fact remains that Diana felt threatened enough to put those fears down in writing and share them with someone she trusted. This letter became public knowledge, and it sent shockwaves through the media. People who had mourned Diana suddenly had a new lens through which to view her final months. Was she truly in danger? Were her fears justified? Or was she simply overwhelmed by the pressures of her position and the relentless media attention? This is where the painting comes in. The artist took that moment of vulnerability, that expression of fear, and put it on canvas. But here's where it gets interesting. Even the person who created this work admitted it wasn't very good. In fact, she went on record calling it a very bad painting. She believed that the poor quality itself was part of what made people so angry. It wasn't just the subject matter. It was a crude, almost amateurish execution. The dripping red on Diana's lips that could be interpreted as either smeared lipstick or blood. The desperate quality of the text painted right onto the canvas. Everything about it felt raw, unpolished, and uncomfortable to look at. Critics absolutely savaged it. Some said the artist had no technical skill whatsoever. Others were outraged by what they saw as a gross exploitation of Diana's memory. How dare someone paint the princess like this? How dare they suggest violence or conspiracy? How dare they make money off a dead woman's fears? The backlash was swift and brutal. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming. All that controversy would transform this supposedly terrible painting into one of the most talked about artworks of its generation. To understand why this painting exists at all, we need to talk about the culture surrounding Diana's death. When she died in that tunnel in Paris in 1997, the world went into collective mourning. Millions of people who had never met her felt a genuine sense of loss. Conspiracy theories began circulating almost immediately. The official explanation was a tragic accident, a driver under the influence, speeding to escape paparazzi, losing control of the vehicle. But many people couldn't accept that narrative. They pointed to Diana's troubled relationship with the royal family. They questioned the circumstances of the crash. They analyzed every detail of that fateful night, looking for evidence of foul play. These theories lived on the internet, in books, in documentaries, and in the minds of people who simply couldn't let go. For some, believing that Diana was murdered was easier than accepting that such a vibrant, beloved figure could die in such a mundane, preventable way. The painting we're discussing tapped directly into those feelings. It gave visual form to the whispers and suspicions that had haunted Diana's legacy for years. It asked uncomfortable questions without providing any answers. And perhaps most importantly, it refused to present Diana as the sanitized, perfect princess that official portraits showed. Instead, it showed her as frightened, vulnerable, and very human. The ambiguity of the blood or lipstick on her lips is crucial here. If it's lipstick, then maybe it's just smeared from crying, from distress, from the normal imperfections of a woman in crisis. If it's blood, then the painting becomes something much darker, a suggestion of violence, of harm, of the death that was yet to come when Diana supposedly wrote that letter to Paul Burrell. The artist never clarified which interpretation was correct. In interviews, she acknowledged both readings and seemed perfectly comfortable with the fact that people would see whatever they wanted to see in those red streaks. This wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate choice to make viewers confront their own assumptions and beliefs about what happened to Diana. Now you might be wondering, what kind of person creates something like this? Who looks at one of the most tragic events in recent history and decides to make it into a painting that critics would later call sick and the visual equivalent of tabloid journalism? We'll get to that story in just a moment. But first, I want you to consider what this painting represents on a deeper level. It's not just about Diana. It's about how we process grief, tragedy, and celebrity in modern culture. It's about the uncomfortable space between public mourning and private fear. It's about the conspiracy theories that live in the shadows of official narratives. And it's about the role of art in forcing us to look at things we'd rather ignore. This painting wasn't created by an established artist working in a prestigious studio. It wasn't commissioned by a museum or a wealthy patron. It came from somewhere much more unexpected, from someone whose life story reads more like a cautionary tale than an art world success story. The woman who painted it had spent years struggling to make ends meet, working jobs that had nothing to do with art, watching her dreams slip further and further away. She had painted Diana over and over again, creating dozens of portraits that she eventually destroyed because she simply didn't have the space to keep them. This painting, the one that would change everything, almost didn't survive either. When it was first completed, there were no grand plans for it. The artist priced it at a pittance, barely enough to cover her costs. She displayed it in a tiny, obscure gallery that most people had never heard of. If the story had ended there, this painting would have been forgotten, thrown away, or sold for pocket change to someone who happened to wander into that gallery. But that's not what happened. Instead, this crude, controversial, allegedly terrible painting caught the eye of one of the most powerful figures in the contemporary art world. And when he decided to buy it, everything changed. The painting that nobody wanted suddenly became the painting everyone was talking about. The artist who could barely pay her bills became an overnight sensation. And the art world found itself wrestling with questions about exploitation, taste, and whether there are some subjects that should simply be off limits. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can understand how this painting went from a garage gallery to international headlines, we need to meet the woman who created it. Her story is just as controversial as the artwork itself, and it's essential to understanding why this painting exists in the first place. The woman who would create one of the most controversial paintings of Princess Diana didn't start her life planning to become an artist. She was born Melissa Jane Robson in 1969 in Alnwick, a small market town in Northumberland, England. It's a picturesque place, known for its medieval castle and quiet, traditional English charm. But for young Melissa, it wasn't a fairy tale setting. Her childhood was marked by difficulty and tension, particularly in her relationship with her stepfather. The home environment became so unbearable that at just 13 years old, she made a decision that would shape the rest of her life. She ran away. Think about that for a moment. 13 years old. Most kids that age are worried about school exams and making friends. Melissa was trying to survive on her own. By the time she was 17, she had become a mother. Her life could have gone in any number of directions at that point, most of them bleak. She was a teenage mother with no stable home, no career prospects, and no safety net to fall back on. But she was also fiercely determined to create a better life for herself and her child. She moved to London with her son, hoping the big city would offer opportunities that her small hometown never could. London did offer opportunities, but not the kind that appear in glossy magazines or feel-good stories. To keep food on the table and a roof over their heads, Melissa took whatever work she could find. She waited tables, scrubbed floors as a cleaner, and eventually, she turned to a profession that would later become a focal point of media attention when she achieved fame. She became a stripper. Night after night, she performed for crowds of strangers, using her body to earn money in one of the few industries where a young woman without formal education or connections could make decent pay. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, but it kept her and her son alive. During this period, something else was happening in Melissa's life. She was developing an intense interest in creativity and self-expression. She had always been drawn to making things, to performing, to finding ways to communicate feelings that were too complex for ordinary words. In 1995, she made a symbolic break from her past by changing her name. Melissa Jane Robson became Stella Vine. The new name was inspired by Andy Warhol, the legendary pop artist who understood better than almost anyone how to turn controversy and celebrity culture into art. Warhol had changed his name too, transforming himself from Andrew Warhola into an icon. Stella wanted that same kind of reinvention. She didn't feel like she belonged to either of her father's families anymore, so she created a new identity for herself, one that belonged entirely to her. But changing your name doesn't automatically change your circumstances. Stella was still working as a stripper, still struggling financially, still wondering if there was more to life than the daily grind of survival. Then she discovered painting. Between 1999 and 2001, she attended part-time classes at the Hampstead School of Art, a private institution where she could explore her artistic interests while still maintaining her other work. She would take her son to the classes and paint while he was there, grabbing whatever moments she could to develop her skills. At Hampstead, she started painting the people around her, her family members, friends, ordinary people living ordinary lives. But she also became fascinated with celebrities, particularly those who seemed troubled or tragic in some way. She painted the poet Sylvia Plath, who had died by suicide. She painted musicians and actors whose lives had been marked by darkness and difficulty. And she painted herself, or versions of herself, images of strippers and nightclub scenes drawn from her own experiences. This wasn't the kind of art you typically saw in galleries at the time. It was raw, emotional, and deeply personal. Some people thought it was brilliant, others thought it showed a lack of technical skill. But everyone who saw it had a reaction. And that's something Stella was learning to value. Art that made people feel nothing was forgettable. Art that made people uncomfortable, angry, or moved. That was powerful. In 2001, Stella got her first real break. She was invited to exhibit in a show called Vote Stuckist, organized by an art movement called the Stuckists. This group was deliberately provocative, positioning themselves against what they saw as the pretentious, overly conceptual art that dominated the mainstream scene. They wanted paintings that were about genuine emotion and human experience, not intellectual puzzles or ironic gestures. Stella's work fit perfectly with their ethos. She showed paintings of Sylvia Plath, her stepfather, a stripper, and a life painting from her art school classes. The exhibition led to her becoming more involved with the Stuckist movement, and in August 2001, she even married Charles Thompson, one of the co-founders of the group in New York. The marriage was short-lived and unconventional from the start. They didn't live together, and after just 8 weeks, they separated. But the connection to the Stuckists gave Stella visibility in the art world and helped her develop confidence in her own voice as an artist. She founded her own group called the Westminster Stuckists, though she later renamed it the Unstuckists, perhaps signaling her desire to remain independent even within a movement that prided itself on independence. By 2003, Stella had decided to take a major risk. She opened her own gallery called Rosie Wild on Whitecross Street in East London. It was a small space, but it was hers. She lived and worked in a studio above the gallery while her son lived in the basement. The gallery was meant to be a space for emerging contemporary artists, people like herself who were creating honest, emotional work that didn't fit into the conventional art world. It was a beautiful dream, but dreams don't pay the bills. The gallery was hemorrhaging money, and Stella was facing the very real possibility that she would have to close it down. She was back where she had always been, on the edge of survival, wondering if her art would ever be more than just a hobby she couldn't afford. This was the period when Stella became obsessed with Princess Diana. The obsession had started years earlier, shortly after Diana's death in 1997. Like millions of people around the world, Stella had been shocked and devastated by the news. But for her, the grief went deeper. She saw something of herself in Diana. Here was a woman who had been trapped in an impossible situation, living under constant scrutiny, trying to maintain a perfect image while privately falling apart. Stella understood what it felt like to perform for others, to show one face to the world while hiding your true feelings. She understood what it meant to be judged, objectified, and reduced to a single dimension. In Diana, she saw a kindred spirit. Stella started reading everything she could find about Diana's death. She went down rabbit holes on the internet, exploring conspiracy theories about the crash in Paris. She read about the paparazzi chase, about the driver who had been drinking, about the allegations of foul play and cover-ups. She read about Paul Burrell's revelations regarding the letter Diana had written expressing fear for her life. All of this information swirled around in Stella's mind, mixing with her own experiences of fear, vulnerability, and survival. She started painting Diana compulsively. Over and over again, she put the princess on canvas, trying to capture something that the official portraits and photographs never showed. She created as many as 30 different paintings of Diana. Each one explored a different aspect of the princess, a different emotional truth, a different angle on the tragedy. But Stella had a practical problem. Her studio was small, and oil paintings take time to dry. She simply didn't have the space to store 30 large canvases while they cured. So she made a brutal decision. She took almost all of them and threw them in a skip, a large waste container. Gone. Destroyed. Years of work, hours of emotional investment, all tossed away because there was no room to keep them. She kept only one. Just one painting survived the purge, and it was the one that would change her life forever. That painting was the one we discussed earlier, the one with Diana's frightened eyes and the ambiguous red on her lips, the one with the desperate title painted right onto the canvas. When Stella first completed it, she had no grand expectations. She wanted to price it at just £100, barely enough to cover the cost of materials. A friend convinced her to raise the price slightly, but even then, it was listed for only £600. This was not the price of fine art destined for museum collections. This was the price of something you might buy to decorate your living room if you happen to like the subject matter. Stella included the painting in a show at the Transition Gallery, a tiny exhibition space run by an artist named Kathy Lomax. The gallery wasn't in some fashionable art district. It was housed in a converted garage in Hackney, an area of London that was still rough around the edges at the time. The show was called Girl on Girl, featuring work by female artists. It was the kind of exhibition that might draw a few dozen visitors if you were lucky, the kind that would be reviewed in small art blogs if it was reviewed at all. Stella had no reason to believe this painting would be any different from the dozens of other works she had created and shown over the years. It would hang on the wall for a few weeks. Maybe someone would buy it. Maybe it would end up back in her studio, waiting for the day when she finally gave up on art altogether. But on one particular day, someone walked into that converted garage in Hackney and stood in front of Stella Vine's painting of Princess Diana. This person wasn't an ordinary gallery visitor. He was Charles Saatchi, one of the most powerful and controversial art collectors in the world. And when he looked at that painting with its crude technique and disturbing subject matter, he didn't see a failure. He saw exactly what he had been looking for, Charles Saatchi wasn't just any art collector. By 2004, he had already established himself as one of the most influential tastemakers in the contemporary art world. He had made his fortune in advertising, building the Saatchi & Saatchi agency into a global powerhouse. But it was his eye for art that truly set him apart. Saatchi had an uncanny ability to spot talent before anyone else recognized it. He had launched the careers of artists like Damien Hirst, famous for his shark preserved in formaldehyde. He had championed Tracey Emin, whose Unmade Bed became one of the most notorious artworks of the 1990s. He had supported the Chapman brothers, whose disturbing sculptures pushed every boundary of good taste. When Charles Saatchi bought your work, it meant something. It meant you had arrived. So when Saatchi walked into that converted garage in Hackney and saw Stella Vine's painting of Diana, he immediately understood its potential. He didn't care that critics might call it crude or amateurish. He didn't care that the subject matter was controversial. In fact, those were probably the exact reasons he liked it. Saatchi had always been drawn to art that provoked strong reactions, art that made people uncomfortable, art that started conversations and generated headlines. This painting of Diana with blood or lipstick dripping from her mouth, with that desperate cry for help painted across the canvas, this was exactly the kind of work that would get people talking. He bought it on the spot for £600. For Stella Vine, this moment was nothing short of miraculous. Just days earlier, she had been contemplating giving up entirely. Her gallery was failing. She was running out of money. She had spent years trying to make it as an artist, and it seemed like the universe was telling her it was time to accept defeat and go back to stripping or waiting tables or whatever other work she could find. Then suddenly, out of nowhere, Charles Saatchi had bought her painting. Not just bought it, but bought it with clear intention. He told her he planned to include it in an upcoming exhibition at his gallery called New Blood, a show designed to introduce new artists to the world. Stella couldn't quite believe it was happening. She later said that Saatchi's purchase came just in time, that she had been on the verge of giving up completely because she wasn't making any money. But Saatchi buying the painting was only the beginning. What happened next would thrust Stella Vine into the spotlight in ways she had never imagined. The New Blood exhibition opened in March 2004 at the Saatchi Gallery, which was then housed in County Hall, right on the south bank of the Thames. It was a prestigious venue, and the opening night drew critics, collectors, journalists, and art world insiders. Stella's painting of Diana was given prominent placement in the show. And as Saatchi had anticipated, it immediately became the focal point of intense controversy. The media coverage was overwhelming. Newspapers, magazines, television programs, and websites all picked up the story. But they weren't just talking about the painting itself. They were talking about Stella's background, the fact that she was a single mother, the fact that she had worked as a stripper, the fact that this unknown artist had sold a painting for just £600 to a millionaire collector. All of these elements combined to create a narrative that the media couldn't resist. Here was a struggling stripper who had painted a controversial image of the dead princess, and now a wealthy art dealer had swooped in to make her famous. It was a story with class conflict, sexual politics, royal controversy, and artistic rebellion all rolled into one. The price of Stella's other paintings doubled virtually overnight. Work that she had struggled to sell for a few £100s was suddenly commanding serious money. Galleries that had never returned her calls were now fighting to represent her. Critics who would have ignored her a month earlier were now writing lengthy pieces analyzing her work. Saatchi had achieved exactly what he set out to do. He had created a sensation, generated massive publicity, and in the process, he had made a very smart investment. The £600 painting he had purchased would eventually be worth many times that amount. But the attention wasn't all positive. In fact, much of it was brutally negative. Critics attacked the painting from every angle. Some focused on what they saw as a lack of technical skill. They said Stella couldn't paint properly, that her work showed no understanding of anatomy, composition, or color theory. Others were outraged by the subject matter. They accused her of exploiting Diana's memory for personal gain, of turning tragedy into a cheap spectacle, of disrespecting the dead. One critic described the work as the visual equivalent of tabloid journalism, suggesting that Stella was doing with paint what trashy newspapers did with words and photographs. The comparison was meant as an insult, implying that her work was sensationalist, lowbrow, and devoid of artistic merit. The most disturbing aspect of the painting, for many viewers, was the ambiguity of those red streaks on Diana's lips. Stella had been quite open in interviews about her intention. She said she had deliberately painted Diana's lips in such a way that viewers could interpret them as either smeared with lipstick or smeared with blood. This wasn't an accident or a failure of technique. It was a conscious artistic choice. If you saw lipstick, then maybe the painting was about a woman in emotional distress, crying, her makeup ruined by tears. If you saw blood, then the painting became something much darker, a suggestion of violence, harm, or death. The ambiguity forced viewers to confront their own assumptions and beliefs about what had happened to Diana. Many people found this deeply offensive. They felt that Stella was playing games with a tragedy, that she was exploiting conspiracy theories for shock value. How dare she suggest that Diana had been harmed? How dare she profit from people's grief and paranoia? The painting seemed to give visual form to every dark whisper and internet rumor about Diana's death. And for those who believed the official story, this felt like a betrayal. Diana deserved to be remembered with dignity and respect, not through crude paintings that suggested murder and conspiracy. Stella defended her work by explaining her personal connection to it. She told interviewers that she had been deeply affected by Diana's death, and that she saw something of herself in the princess. She said the painting wasn't just about Diana at all. It was also a self-portrait. She famously stated that the picture was about two women, one who lived in Kensington Palace and another who lived down on Whitecross Street. When she looked at the painting, she saw herself as much as she saw Diana. Both women had been trapped in difficult circumstances. Both had been judged and objectified by others. Both had struggled to maintain control over their own lives and images. This explanation resonated with some people, who began to see the painting as a meditation on female vulnerability and the ways women are consumed by public attention. But it did nothing to convince the critics who simply thought the work was tasteless. Saatchi wasn't finished. A few weeks later, he purchased another painting by Stella Vine. This one depicted Rachel Whitehair, a young woman who had died from a heroin overdose. The photograph of Rachel's body, slumped over in a bedsit, had become infamous in Britain as part of anti-drug campaigns. Stella's painting showed Rachel with blood running from her mouth, similar to the Diana portrait. The painting was included in the New Blood exhibition alongside the Diana work. And once again, controversy erupted. Rachel Whitehair's parents were still grieving their daughter. When they learned about the painting, they were devastated. They contacted the police, asking for the work to be removed from the exhibition. They felt it was a violation of their daughter's memory, an exploitation of their family's private tragedy. The police backed the parents' request and asked Saatchi to withdraw the painting from the show. Saatchi, in a move that said a lot about his approach to controversy, delegated the decision to Stella herself. He told her she could choose to keep the painting on display or take it down. Stella refused to remove it. She insisted that the work was not meant to be disrespectful. She said she had painted Rachel because she felt a connection to her story, because she understood what it meant to struggle and suffer, because she wanted to acknowledge Rachel's humanity rather than reducing her to a cautionary tale. The painting stayed up, and the media firestorm intensified. There was another dimension to the controversy as well. Charles Thompson, Stella's ex-husband and the co-founder of the Stuckists, came forward to claim that he and the Stuckist movement were the ones who had truly discovered Stella, not Saatchi. He said that when he met Stella, she had been painting ordinary portraits and still lifes with no expression or emotion. He claimed that he had told her to focus on her drawings of strippers and nightclub scenes, that he had recognized where her real talent lay. He felt that Saatchi was hijacking the Stuckists' identity and taking credit for work that others had done. Thompson even reported Saatchi to the Office of Fair Trading, alleging that the collector was abusing his position in the art market. The complaint was eventually dismissed, but it added yet another layer of drama to the story. Through all of this, Stella's life was changing at a pace she could barely process. She went from being completely unknown to being featured in major newspapers and art magazines. She was invited to give interviews, to appear on radio and television programs, to speak about her work and her background. Some interviewers were genuinely interested in understanding her artistic vision. Others seemed more focused on the sensational aspects of her story, asking intrusive questions about her time as a stripper, or pressing her to explain why she thought it was acceptable to paint dead women. The attention was overwhelming, and not all of it was welcome. Stella later admitted that the sudden fame left her feeling depressed and even suicidal at times. She had gotten what she wanted, recognition and financial stability, but the cost was higher than she had anticipated. She had become a public figure, and that meant she was no longer in control of her own narrative. The backlash against Stella Vine's work reached its peak in August 2005, when the Guardian newspaper published a list that would haunt her for years. The article was titled, "The 10 Worst Paintings in Britain," and there, sitting at number 3, was her painting of Princess Diana. The list had been compiled by David Andrews, a caricaturist who worked in Leicester Square, and his assessment was brutal. To be included on such a list wasn't just criticism. It was public humiliation. It suggested that Stella's work wasn't merely controversial or divisive, but actively bad, so poorly executed that it deserved to be singled out as an embarrassment to British art. For someone who had already been struggling with the intense media scrutiny and the mixed reactions to her work, this was devastating. Stella had never claimed to be a technical master. She had even agreed with critics who said her work was crude or rough around the edges. But there's a difference between acknowledging imperfection and being told that your art is among the worst in the entire country. The psychological toll of sudden fame, combined with the relentless criticism, pushed Stella into a dark place. She later spoke openly about feeling depressed and even suicidal during this period. The very success that should have brought her joy and validation instead became a source of pain and anxiety. Unable to cope with the pressure, Stella made a drastic decision. She sold the Rosie Wilde Gallery, the space she had poured so much of herself into creating. She left London and traveled to Spain, where she took a job teaching art to children. It was a complete retreat from the art world that had simultaneously elevated and destroyed her. In Spain, away from the British media and the constant judgment, she tried to find some peace and perspective. Eventually, she moved back to England, returning to Alnwick, her hometown, the place she had fled as a troubled teenager. She donated some of her paintings to the local Bailiffgate Museum, a gesture that seemed to represent a desire to reconnect with her roots. While Stella was struggling with her sudden notoriety, another chapter in the saga of forbidden Diana images was unfolding, and it involved one of the biggest pop stars in the world. George Michael, the singer who had dominated the charts in the 80s and 90s, had been a friend of Princess Diana. They had bonded over their shared experiences of living under constant media scrutiny, and Michael had been genuinely devastated by her death. When he learned about Stella Vine's work, something about it resonated with him in a way that the sanitized official tributes to Diana never had. In 2005, Michael purchased another of Stella's Diana paintings. This one was even more provocative than the first. It showed Diana in an evening gown, looking elegant and composed. But behind her, painted in stark letters, were 3 words that formed a question: murdered, pregnant, embalmed. These were the conspiracy theories that had swirled around Diana's death for years, condensed into 3 brutal words. The suggestion that Diana had been pregnant when she died. The allegation that she had been murdered rather than killed in an accident. The disturbing detail about the embalming of her body, which some conspiracy theorists claimed had been done unusually quickly to hide evidence. George Michael paid £25,000 for this painting. That's a staggering increase from the £600 that Saatchi had paid for the first Diana work just a year earlier. The purchase made headlines, and the Sun newspaper condemned the painting as sick. But Michael didn't care about the criticism. He told people that he had fallen in love with the piece after his partner Kenny Goss introduced him to Stella's work. He appreciated the directness of it, the refusal to pretend that Diana's death was a simple tragedy with no complicated questions attached. But Stella's paintings weren't the only controversial Diana artworks that had caused problems. Years earlier, in 1981, another Diana painting had become the center of a scandal. This was the official portrait commissioned by the National Portrait Gallery to commemorate Diana's engagement to Prince Charles. The artist chosen for this commission was Brian Organ, a respected portrait painter. The finished work showed Diana in the yellow drawing room of Buckingham Palace, seated in a relaxed pose, wearing trousers, which was almost unheard of for a female royal in an official portrait at the time. The portrait was unveiled on July 23, 1981, just 6 days before the royal wedding. In the first 3 days alone, an estimated 100,000 people flocked to the National Portrait Gallery to see it. But just a month later, on August 29th, the painting became the target of a violent attack. Paul Salmon, a 20-year-old man from Belfast, walked into the gallery and slashed the portrait with a knife. He cut both horizontally and vertically across the canvas, creating severe damage. Security guards immediately grabbed him, and witnesses later reported that he said, "I did it for Ireland," suggesting the attack was a political protest. Salmon was sentenced to 6 months in prison and ordered to pay nearly $2,000 toward restoration. Despite the depression and the retreat from London, Stella's story eventually took a more positive turn. In 2007, the Modern Art Oxford Museum mounted the first major exhibition of her work. This was significant validation. The exhibition was accompanied by a catalog that included an essay by Germaine Greer, the famous feminist writer and intellectual. Greer also gave a public talk at the museum about Stella's work, lending her considerable cultural authority to the defense of an artist who had been written off by many. The Financial Times published a review that placed Stella's work in a broader artistic tradition, writing that her examination of celebrity culture descended from the same lineage as Andy Warhol and even Hans Christian Andersen. This was high praise, suggesting that Stella wasn't just creating shock art for its own sake, but was genuinely exploring important themes about fame, tragedy, and the stories we tell ourselves about public figures. The story of controversial Diana paintings raises profound questions about art, grief, and the limits of acceptable expression. Should there be subjects that are off limits to artists? Is it possible to create work about a tragedy without exploiting it? Who gets to decide what is respectful and what is offensive? What seems clear is that Diana's image, even decades after her death, remains powerful enough to provoke extreme reactions. The paintings that were deemed too offensive to show are now part of history. They tell us as much about ourselves and our relationship to celebrity and tragedy as they tell us about Diana herself.